So this is going to be a little bit of a longer conversation, talking through a couple different ways that currency has been structured and set up internationally in terms of how different national currencies interact and the relationships between them. And so for a good chunk of human history, many countries relied upon a metal-based currency, right? Gold or silver, something along those lines, which worked reasonably well in that it had a lot of those properties that we want for currency, right? You can make numerable coins, it's easily transportable, it's universally more or less accepted, which was great, but metal-based currencies as a system really had some deep flaws in it. For one thing, simply looking at a coin, it's not always possible to tell what the actual purity of that coin is. And so, you can put coins on scales and try and weigh them and balance value. But the purity question really kind of was always an uncertainty about, particularly with newly minted coins, so that in places where coins were often in circulation, older coins were oftentimes preferred because it was sort of known, well, at that particular time, these coins minted had a certain purity. But that's a lot of information uncertainty that kind of comes with metal-based currency. Probably the bigger issue is that supply was really limited and didn't always match sort of the demand for currency. And so for the vast majority of human history, people had to sort of work around an absence of currency with barter and other kinds of systems because there just wasn't enough money in circulation to be able to accommodate economic activity. And the supply of currency ended up being really prone to shocks, where you'd have the discovery of new mines or sources of metal, and you'd get sort of an influx in your currency in some places, whereas in other places you just wouldn't have enough currency to meet demand, and so you're ending up exporting wealth from your country to purchase the metal to be able to create your own currency. And so metal-based currencies really had some deep problems that undermine them as a global system over the long term, particularly as capitalism sort of takes hold in many different countries. And so after World War II, the United States, through the Bretton Woods conference and then through a series of agreements, establishes a new global currency system that's kind of a gold-based system, a gold standard system, but not quite. And so the way that this worked is that from about 1948 until 1971, the United States set its currency in terms of gold. So each dollar was worth 1/32 of an ounce of gold. And in theory, if you were a state, you could take a dollar to the United States Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, and request 1/32 of an ounce of gold for every dollar you had in your possession. And other countries didn't set their currencies in terms of gold. They set their currencies in terms of a fixed exchange rate to the dollar. And so they wouldn't exchange their currencies for gold. They would exchange their currencies for dollars, and dollars were held by central banks as the currency reserve that was used to allow for a predictable exchange rate system around the world, where the value of the British pound would be set to $2 equals 1 British pound, and that would be sort of the set relationship that everybody would know and would be transparent and would be stable. And this was really desirable at the end of World War II. If we think about sort of what is the advantage of a gold standard system, a system that's sort of founded in metal. And probably the biggest benefit is that, in theory, countries that are backing their currency by gold aren't going to just flip on their printing press and print paper money. Paper money that's possible, right? You can just print as much as you want. But if your currency has to be linked to gold, if you have to have a certain amount of gold in your vaults in order to back that currency, then in theory you're not going to do that. And countries might have incentives to just flip on their printing press. Germany certainly did that as a way to pay off their foreign debts, to get out of the reparations from World War I. In the Great Depression, countries were devaluing or debasing their currency to bring the value of currency down to help boost their exports, which is something we'll talk about here in a little bit when we talk about value of currencies and its sort of economic effects. So there were reasons why countries might do this. And so having a system that was fixed, having a system that was transparent, having a system that was backed by gold seemed really appealing, right? And that you're not going to have the rampant hyperinflation of Nazi Germany. You're not going to have countries, adjusting the value of their currency for these sort of malicious economic activities, which were sometimes called beggar thy neighbor policies, that potentially it's good for you, but it comes at the expense of your neighbors. The downside for having a fixed, a currency that's sort of fixed to gold is that you now have a fixed supply of currency. Sure, you're not going to get hyperinflation or potentially even inflation at all over the long term, but as your economy grows, if you can't increase the money supply to accommodate that, you're going to find yourself in a situation where you have too many goods and services available relative to the currency to sort of do buying and selling and transactions, and that results in deflation. And so that's kind of concerning. The other problem that comes into play is that you don't have as many tools to be able to conduct monetary policy, to set interest rates, to expand the money supply when you need to counter recessions, to counter unemployment. And so it creates sort of a limited tool set of economic tools that countries have available to them, which is potentially problematic and maybe not surprising. That fixed exchange rate system that the United States set up by 1971 was kind of falling apart. Countries were walking away from it, and in 1971 the United States announced that it was no longer going to fix the dollar to gold. That it would move to a different kind of currency system. And over the next 20, 30 years, most other countries moved away from that fixed exchange rate system backed by the dollar and adopted a floating exchange rate system, right? Where the value of a particular currency in terms of gold or in terms of dollars or in terms of whatever isn't set by law. Most things, the price isn't set by law. Most things, the price is set by supply and demand, right? Do people want to buy this thing? Do they want to sell this thing? What's the demand? And that's what's going to determine the price. And so there are financial markets that buy and sell and trade currencies against other currencies, and they're conducting trillions of dollars worth of exchanges each day. And that process of buying and selling ends up setting the supply of currency, and so the value of currency. And so the supply of dollars that are out in those international markets come from the value of U.S. imports, right? When the United States buys stuff from other countries, it pays in dollars. Those dollars go out into international markets and get traded and exchanged. When the U.S. gives foreign aid, it gives it in dollars, and those dollars have to be sold off in international exchanges for local currency. And when investment from the United States goes out into the world, when I invest in the Japanese stock market, I have to first sell my dollars and buy yen. That puts dollars out into the global supply of dollars. And then from that supply, there are people who are trying to buy those dollars with their own currencies, right? And they're doing that because they want to buy U.S. exports, right? They have to pay for those U.S. exports in dollars. It's demand for dollars because people want to invest in the U.S. economy, and you can't show up in New York at the New York Stock Exchange with your euros and hope to buy something. You have to first exchange that for dollars, and so that's going to mean buying dollars on these international markets. And so there's this constant global trade going on that determines the price of the U.S. dollar relative to every other currency that's out there in circulation. And I think maybe the way to think about this is if we were to just sort of momentarily just fix the supply of dollars. There's no more, no less. And then think about what happens as demand changes, right? And so when demand is high for dollars, right, lots of people want dollars. And if I show up at an international, currency exchange and say, I've got dollars, people are going to just flock toward me to try to buy those dollars. And they're going to say, oh my gosh, we're trying to get a hold of dollars. Will you take €1 for these dollars? Somebody says, no, I'll give you a euro quarter for $1. And somebody says, no, I'll give you €2. And you say, oh, €2 for $1 sounds like a really good deal. I'll take that exchange. And now you sell off your dollar and you get that euro. What we would say is, because demand is high, because people are paying more for each of those dollars, the value of the dollar is rising relative to other currencies. And that's a function of demand outpacing supply. But it could also be flipped around, right? I mean, I could walk into international currency markets and announce to people, I've got dollars, and they kind of wave and say, everybody's got dollars. Dollars are a dime a dozen. That's my best currency joke. That dollars can't be a dime a dozen. $12 or $12, not a dime. Nonetheless, that's basically the sense, right? That everybody's got dollars. I'm not going to give you my euros for dollars. I can get dollars anywhere. And if you want to sell those dollars, you have to start making people a deal. I'll give you, a $2 just for €1. Please, somebody take these dollars. And so because the supply is, because the demand is low and there's the supply that's out there, the price is going to fall relative to other currencies. Okay, so markets are continually balancing these currencies, and as a result, you get relative stability reflecting the strength of countries' economies, what they're consuming, what they're producing, the desirability of their investment, their economy is a place for investment. All of that is going to drive the value of currency. And that has really big effects for what's happening in terms of the domestic economy, right? So when the dollar is strong, I don't like strong and weak, because strong and weak, which is oftentimes the language people use to talk about this, implies like good and not good. But when the dollar is expensive or high or strong relative to other currencies, what that means is that imports look really cheap, right? Stuff coming in, you can buy a lot of it because everybody wants to get their hands on dollars, and they'll give you a lot of stuff for that. But if you're an exporter in the United States and you're trying to sell stuff abroad, you go around to trade shows and you show people your glossy 4-color booklet of products, and they say, well, that all looks great, except everything's priced in dollars, and it's really expensive. It's really hard for me to get dollars. I have to pay a lot for it. I just can't buy your stuff. And so domestic manufacturers end up suffering when the value of the dollar is high. And so if you are a domestic manufacturer in the United States, you might prefer a situation where the dollar is relatively weak or low or cheap relative to other currencies, because that makes it easier to export. And if it's easier to export, you're going to export more stuff. You're going to potentially expand your factory. It potentially means hiring more workers. And so it's possible to improve your overall economy by weakening your currency relative to other currencies. And vice versa, right? If your currency becomes strong relative to other currencies, that may end up hurting your domestic economy, even though you're able to buy a lot of stuff. You're able to buy a lot of imports. There's also a dimension that affects tourists. So if the dollar is strong or high or expensive relative to other currencies, then as a tourist from the United States going to other countries, things are going to look really cheap. People will give you a lot of stuff for your dollar. But if you're a foreign tourist visiting the United States and you have to buy dollars, it's going to be expensive. And so that's maybe going to affect the tourism industry, right? Vice versa, when the dollar is weak, when the dollar is low, when the dollar is cheap relative to other currencies, it is harder for Americans to travel abroad because things are expensive. But foreigners are able to come to the United States for tourism and live, far better than they might, because the exchange rate is favorable when the dollar is weak relative to those other currencies. And so the value of currencies isn't just an abstract or ephemeral thing. It has real concrete implications for the economy and how competitive that economy is in the larger world. So for that, I'm going to sort of flag two additional kind of systems that kind of try to thread this needle of the stability that came with the fixed exchange rate system versus the floating exchange rate system. So some countries rely upon a fixed but adjustable currency. And so the idea is that we're going to have this set relationship and it's probably going to hold for the foreseeable future, but at some point we may adjust it, and we reserve the right to adjust it. And maybe we'll promise to only adjust it by a certain percentage, but that's a possibility that's sort of built in if we feel that we need to increase our exports and therefore weaken our currency, make our currency cheaper relative to others, or if we feel like our economy is really going strong and if we increase the value of our currency, we can benefit even more from increased imports. So countries might make those decisions. Another model would be the limited floating exchange rate system. This is what China does, where the central bank essentially says the currency can float on international markets, sort of. People can buy and sell and trade this currency, and the value will go up and down based on supply and demand. But for the well-being of our economy, we really only want to see it float or move or change within a certain band. And if it starts getting too strong relative to that sort of upper threshold, the central bank will step in and it will print more of its currency to increase supply and drive down that exchange rate. If the exchange rate starts falling too low, the central bank might step in, it might stop printing currency, it might start pulling currency out of circulation, it might start selling off foreign assets to try to drive that relationship back up. And so it allows for a level of movement, but the central bank ensures that there's a significant degree of predictability in what that exchange rate looks like over time. And so the point is that we have a variety of different systems that countries can set up to try to direct and manage what exchange rates look like from one currency to another. There are some trade-offs with going with a fixed exchange rate versus a floating exchange rate kind of system, and I'll talk about that in a subsequent conversation.